I'm going to kick us off with a question for Beverly. What recommendations do you have for physicians that are working with African American communities to ensure early detection and diagnosis?
That's a great question. And, I would say the recommendation, just because it's such a pivotal time. And so when families or individuals are coming to a healthcare setting, they're coming because they want a trusted medical professional to listen to their needs. And so listening is very important. Taking the time to listen, taking the time to ask questions of that patient, getting to know that patient, understanding their family dynamics and their health dynamics, removing that unconscious bias and even conscious bias that individuals may have, and look at this person as an individual that's coming to you for help. Because we see doctors, we see clinicians, we see nurses as trusted individuals. So really building that rapport, but also taking the lead to ask those questions. Because I think when you know your patient, when you have that rapport with your patient, you know the questions to ask. In our experience and what we've seen is that a lot of times, the patient is waiting for the doctor to ask those questions. And we as patients are waiting for that doctor to say, okay, are you having concerns with memory and with memory loss and thinking? And so I think it's building that rapport and that trust when you see a patient or a family that's coming in. And that takes time. So I know a lot of times physicians and clinicians are short on time, but that investment that you make to really build the relationship with your patients and their families is really important. So a lot of times when we come to the family, it's not just myself, like I'm going to the doctor with my mom or my grandmother. And so just understanding those family dynamics and asking those questions is really important. But then also following up, like don't just give a diagnosis and you don't provide resources or a feedback loop for how they can get support and resources from the community. So it's just building that relationship and having conversation with the patients and their families.
Thank you so much, Beverly. That's really helpful.
The next question is for all the presenters. If the community would pick one thing, what would be the most important one to reduce inequities?
That is a great question. I honestly feel trying to reduce that stigma about being open and having these conversations, because it is one of many uncomfortable conversations that we encounter, that it's almost, if it's not discussed open and honestly, then it doesn't get addressed. And trying to just kind of normalize that conversation would probably be very helpful for reducing.
Thank you. Dr. Cotton?
Yeah, I don't like being able to just pick one thing. That's not how my brain works. I moderated a panel last week, and we were talking about health equity, and you get these sort of, move the community along the spectrum of, not just collaborating to empowerment, right? And so my question was, how do we move from empowerment to transformation? What does transformation look like? And so if I were to have one strategy to address health equity, I think that one, we need to actually understand what health equity is. But I think that we need to also really think about what transformation looks like. One of the things that we talked about, there were a couple of people who had spent a number of years in Africa, and rather than talking about empowerment, they talked about empowerness, which really is the light from within that supports people in making healthy choices. What I'm going to add to that is not only is empowerness important, but I think that people have to jump in the driver's seat, become full citizens, and get involved in democracy. So at the end of the day, everything that we do is an economic decision and it is a political decision. So if we want resources to be available for caregivers and care recipients, I think we get into the policy game. I think that we let our little light shine, I'm going to let it shine, right? But we apply that to a mechanism. And in this country, the mechanism is all about policy. Really, we talking about social determinants of health earlier. My research looks at environments. What are the appropriate levers to shift the environment? So if that's one thing that I have to say about where we even start, I offer that up as an important starting point.
Thank you. Yeah. Beverly, do you have anything to add?
I would just say community mobilization as well. I think in order to bridge a health equity gap and reduce disparities, we have to meet communities where they are. We have to know our communities. We have to be in a posture to really bring the resources to them for those that are not able to readily access. And then to Dr. Cotton's point, think about policies. What are policies that we can change? What are systems? What are processes, procedures that are within systems that we can work together to change so that people have the access, the equitable access that they need for support and resources.
I'm sorry, I'm dipping my chip back into the dip. I know I'm not supposed to do this. We cannot have this conversation. We're talking about Black health, right? We cannot have this conversation without talking about the importance of having a racial consciousness, having a racial lens, and naming structural racism. We are here as a consequence of structural racism. And until we name it, and until we look at eradication strategies that focus on the root causes of these issues, we won't get anywhere. And so we can have all of the interventions that we want, but we can't do policy work with people who don't understand structural racism. It will be ineffective. We can't have interventions with scientists who don't understand structural racism. I'm going to get preachy, so I'm going to chill. But at the end of the day, I think there's a level of intentionality that has to be there, and naming the root causes is important.
Absolutely. Anything else that you guys want to add?
Yeah, I absolutely echo what Dr. Cotton said.
Beautifully said.
It is. You do have to acknowledge that there are not only historical inequities, racism, discrimination that has occurred, but there's current. It's still an issue. It's still a factor. And so when we reach back and we think, and I'm changing gears just a little bit, because when we talk about participation in research, we lean back to Tuskegee, like, that was in the past, that was historical. It happened, we have to recognize it, but it's more than just Tuskegee, it's what we're dealing with currently. And until we look at the undercurrents of inequities, racism, conscious biases, we're not, to Dr. Cotton's point, getting to the root causes of how we bridge the gap. And that takes time, it takes work, but it's necessary in all spaces.
Beverly, earlier in the chat, Colleen had asked, do you consider microaggressions as part of the interpersonal racism you described?
Yeah, so related to the study, I'm not sure if they actually, looked at microaggressions in that way to contribute to the results of the study. But when you think about over a period of time in your lifetime, you're experiencing microaggressions in your day-to-day, in your work, in every facet of your life. It is stressful, and that stress can have a negative impact on your body. And so, I'm not 100% sure if that was included in their study, but it's definitely worth taking notice of it as we look at discrimination and racism. We didn't always know what a microaggression was or what to call it. We knew it was something, but it definitely lends itself to say that, as we take that study and we expand on it and we look at our everyday to-day life, that, microaggressions could contribute to cognitive decline over a period of time. So it's definitely something that, that we need to look at, that we need to consider in our day-to-day life, especially as we seek to reduce stress and navigate all of these challenges that present itself in the form of racism or discrimination.
Thank you, Beverly. I have this question for Lakita, and then after her answer, we'll ask Dr. Cotton and Beverly if they have anything to add. Do you have suggestions for effective communication strategies for caregivers of people living with dementia?
Yeah, absolutely. So before you even get into too much of how to communicate, you want to always have a foundation of just being completely patient and understanding that not every time your first response is going to be the right response, and really recognizing when you could have done something differently or when you could have done something a little better. So if you do not have that component down, then you're not going to get anywhere with your communication, whether it's verbal or nonverbal. But as far as your general individual that may be living with dementia, trying to make sure to always orient in front of that individual, and that you're coming in slowly and making sure that you're not coming in too quickly, and really make sure that you have their attention prior to even engaging in that person. And then once you start to engage in that interaction, you want to show all of those nonverbal cues that you are actually involved in this conversation. You are showing eye contact. You're speaking slow and articulating. Not every time that you come across an individual living with cognitive disabilities or any type of challenges that you need to change the way you speak. Sometimes you just need to slow down, and maybe you need to repeat or have to simplify your wording. So keeping a lot of those things in mind, and also that everything is individualized. Everyone has different strengths and different weaknesses. So really knowing that person and what their strengths are will really be the most beneficial of your time, of their attention, and just making sure that you're putting them in a situation where they can succeed. not sit here and challenge them where now they're too frustrated to even try to communicate with you. And that'll really build that relationship moving forward and really build that rapport and trust as you move forward and encounter some harder decisions and harder discussions.
I think that effective communication is in part related to being a healthy, whole, happy person. I think that when I think about being able to communicate effectively, I think about knowing myself. I think about the information that I need, and I think about the skills that I need to communicate effectively. I also think that having wisdom to apply different communication strategies to different audiences. I think that if I were to say, where people might start, I think that one of the best things a caregiver could do is equip themselves with both information and communication skills so that they can be a health advocate. When you are a health advocate, you're able to prioritize you and your own health so that you can facilitate having discussions on behalf, with, for, along with the care recipient.
Thank you, Dr. Cotton. Beverly, do you have anything to add?
No, the only thing I echo Dr. Cotton and Lakeitha's point, preparation and just knowing yourself and how to communicate. But also, when you're speaking with someone with Alzheimer's or dementia, sometimes you have to step into their world and understand where they're coming from. And so, that's another way, but also understanding that it may not go perfect, and that's perfectly fine. You regroup and you try again.
Sorry, I like to double dip. I'm sorry. I also think it's important to recognize that we aren't always the best messengers. So just think about that. If you are running into a brick wall communicating, what I have seen caregivers do is bring in other people to have that conversation. So don't think that communication is something that you have to do alone. Again, I told you, I've spoken to a lot of families, and I've heard so much about drama. And I think that maybe perhaps what I'll do is, I'm creating work for myself, I shouldn't do that, is go back through some of my interview notes and pull out a list of strategies that were specific to communicating with different audiences. So Ms. Vanessa, I will make sure that I do that within the next 30 days and make sure that that's also, can be paired with my slides.
Thank you, Dr. Cotton. Yes, so you answered the question in the chat about how to effectively communicate with family caregivers who are in denial about a loved one's cognitive decline. Lakeitha and Beverly, do you have anything to add to this? Or should we move to the next question?
I'll say sometimes it's more than one conversation. For people that are in denial, they may not see it because they're too close to it. That's mom, that's dad, and so, or husband or wife. And so they're too close to it. So they're going to shut it down, probably because they're dealing with their own internal, thinking of what this could be, but don't want to accept it. And so, just give that person time, but revisit again and be there for support. And to Dr. Cotton's point, having other people that can step in as well to provide some guidance and feedback there as well.
Thank you. There's
Yeah.
another question in the chat. Go ahead, Nikki.
Sure. So Melissa is asking, any thoughts on the racial dynamics that can so often be influential in a person or family's experience within higher level of care systems like long-term care or assisted living, et cetera?
This is a loaded question. Well, let me put it this way. I think that in some ways, it doesn't matter what level of care someone is at. We know that care is inadequate. Even when a provider may go out of their way to ensure quality care, sometimes it's delivered in a way that actually still creates issues with a patient and the patient's family. I think that these dynamics play out, and what I have to say is it's not just race, it's education, it's geography, it's all of these things that come to bear when persons are looking at higher levels of care. So the answer is yes, race is always on the table. I think that this may go back to an earlier question related to communication, related to how we problem solve. These core skills really become important. And so in many ways, in these spaces, people of color have had to be more resourceful. We've had to hustle. We've had to figure out how to maneuver, going above and beyond to get what we need. And so unfortunately, I still think that those things are at play. And I think that race is there, and it's a dynamic that just has to be accounted for. But I also don't believe that we name those things. And I don't believe that many of us, rather than, don't do this, it's really difficult when you see a loved one going through something to be calm, to be rational, you did this, and this is how I interpret it. Let's talk about the implication of that for our plan of care. And you're one of many providers that we're working with. Let's bring in the entire team so that we can really work through this together. It's really difficult to do that when you see someone, let's just sort of say, not acting in a way that you believe that they should be acting professionally. All right, I'm going to nip it in the bud, right there.
Well, absolutely agree that it's a multitude of things. If it's not race, then it can be education. It can be where a person lives or where they're from, or, it can be a plethora of things. But I also think that, we have to be advocates for our care, not only for ourselves, but for our loved ones, and to address and feel empowered to address any issues. Because for some, they can move, they can go to another long-term care facility or what have you. But for some, that's not an option. And so just being an advocate and applying pressure to address any of those types of concerns that may come up, so that it can change, and so that people recognize and know that you recognize it as well. So it is a loaded question, but those are just, some of the elements.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both because, after it is loaded and there's so many parts of it. There's so much that when we're talking about care for an individual, if you even think back on your own life, all of the years, all of your experiences, every single person that you have come across and your experience with that person, that builds your thought, your perspective on many things. And that's in shapes, forms. We won't even go down that rabbit hole. I'm sure somebody will double dip over here. I won't say who, but when you're considering all of that, especially as far as with care, you want to dive into all those details before you start making any moves moving forward. And when you're making those decisions, know that it won't go well every time. Sometimes you need to find the right pieces and the right people to be involved who have the right strengths to be the most successful, not for themselves, but also the person they're working with.
Thank you, Lakita. We are almost at the end time. So Dr. Cotton, quickly, one last question for you. What suggestions do you have for caregivers for coping with stress related to caregiving? Do you have any specific tips for caregivers?
Yeah, I think this depends on the individual. For some people, it's church. For some people, it can be going for a walk. I think that what is most important is that caregivers stop the behavior of deprioritizing themselves. You have to be well, healthy, happy, whole. You have to be well to be an effective caregiver. And so I think that the strategies are there. I can definitely send over, a systematic review that looks at caregivers coping with stress. But I think that self-prioritization is what I would suggest, and however that manifests in your life in a healthy way.
I love that, Dr. Cotton. Thank you so much. Any last comments from our panelists?
Going back to self-care, I think people also have to know, caregivers have to also know that it is okay to have rest. It is okay to have time for yourself, because if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't be the best caregiver. So just know that you have permission to do that, to have self-care, and that you should build it in. And to also ask for help. A lot of times we're taking care of mom, we're taking care of dad. I got it. I don't need help. Someone once told me, your mom may have had 5, but 5 can't take care of 1. And so we really have to ask for help so that we can be better caregivers, for our loved ones, and even take care of ourselves.
Thank you so much, Beverly. And thank you so much to everybody who participated today. Thank you to our fabulous speakers. We appreciate you sharing your experiences, your insights, and your work with us.